The cold wind howled through the dimly lit street as 17-year-old Maya Reynolds walked home, her hood pulled up against the biting chill. She had stayed late at the library, losing track of time as she worked on an essay for her college applications. With her earbuds in and her head down, she barely noticed the police cruiser slowing down behind her, its headlights casting long shadows ahead. The moment the officer's voice cut through the night, her stomach clenched. "Hey! Stop right there!" Maya froze mid-step, pulling out her earbuds. She turned around slowly, confused. The officer, a stocky white man with a thick mustache, stepped out of the car, one hand hovering near his belt. "What are you doing out here?" His voice was sharp, full of suspicion. "I'm just walking home," Maya answered, her voice calm but cautious. The officer's gaze swept over her, her oversized hoodie, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her dark skin. "Where do you live?" Maya swallowed. "Just a few blocks down." "Aha! And what were you doing?" "I was at the library." He narrowed his eyes. "At this hour?" Maya exhaled slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, the library closes at 10. I lost track of time." The officer took a step closer. "You got any ID?" Maya's heart pounded. "It's in my backpack." "Slowly," he warned. She reached for the zipper, but before she could fully open her bag, the officer's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Don't try anything funny." Maya's breath caught. I wasn't. You match the description of someone we're looking for." He cut her off. "What?" "Suspicious person. Black hoodie. Loitering. You been hanging around here all night." "No, I told you I was at the library." But the officer wasn't listening. His grip tightened. "Turn around. Hands where I can see them." Panic surged through Maya. "Why? I didn't do anything." "Turn around," he repeated, his voice colder now. She hesitated for a second, just a second, but it was enough. In an instant, the officer reached for his belt, and before Maya could react, a burning, searing pain exploded across her face. She screamed, stumbling backward as the pepper spray hit her eyes, blinding her. The world spun as she clutched her face, gasping for air. "Stop resisting," the officer barked. "I'm not." She choked, her voice breaking. "Please, I can't see." She heard the clatter of his radio, his voice calling for backup. "Got a suspect resisting arrest. Possible runaway." Runaway? The words made her stomach twist. She wasn't a runaway. She wasn't a criminal. She was just a kid trying to get home. And now she was on the ground, coughing, her vision blurred by pain. The officer loomed over her, reaching for his cuffs. "Stay down." Maya could barely breathe. She didn't know that in a few minutes, everything would change. That one phone call would flip this cop's world upside down. That the man on the other end of that call would make him regret every single decision he had made tonight. Because Maya Reynolds wasn't just any black teen. She was the daughter of someone who could end his entire career with a single word. Maya's body trembled as she lay on the cold pavement, her face burning, her lungs struggling to pull in air. Her heart pounded against her ribs, panic spreading through her veins like wildfire. The acrid sting of pepper spray clung to her skin, her vision a blur of tears and pain. "Stay down," the officer barked, his knee pressing into her back as he reached for his handcuffs. "You just made this worse for yourself." "I can't breathe," Maya choked out, her voice raw. "You should have thought of that before you resisted," the officer snapped. Resisted? Maya wanted to scream. She had done nothing wrong. She had answered every question, followed every order until he grabbed her. And now, here she was, face down on the ground, a suspect in a crime she knew nothing about. The sound of another car pulling up made the officer glance over his shoulder. Back up. Another cop stepped out, a younger officer, probably in his late 20s. His eyes flickered between Maya and his colleague. "What's going on?" "Suspicious person. Matched a description." She resisted. The younger officer frowned, glancing down at Maya. "She doesn't look like she's resisting now." "She was," the first cop insisted. "Had to subdue her." The younger officer didn't look convinced. Did you run her ID? She doesn't have any. Maya's body flinched with frustration. It's inside my bag, she rasped. The younger officer hesitated, then crouched down, carefully unzipping Maya's backpack. He pulled out a slim leather wallet and flipped it open. His brows lifted slightly as he read the name. Maya Reynolds, he murmured, then frowned as his eyes landed on the school ID beside it. She's a student at Westbridge Academy. The first officer snatched the wallet from his hands, his face twisting. That doesn't mean anything. She could have stolen it. Maya coughed, her fingers curling against the pavement. I didn't. The younger officer was silent for a beat, then reached for her phone, which had fallen to the ground during the struggle. The screen was cracked, but still lit. With a quick press, he saw the most recent call history. One name stood out, Dad. He glanced at Maya, then at the older officer. We should call her emergency contact. I'll handle it, the first officer grunted, yanking the phone away. He scrolled through her contacts, his eyes landing on the number saved under Dad. With a smirk, he hit dial and held the phone to his ear. Maya could hear the faint ringing, her chest tightening. She had no idea if her father would even pick up. He was always busy, always working late. But if he did, the line clicked. A deep, authoritative voice answered. This is Commissioner Reynolds. The first officer's smirk vanished. The younger officer's face paled. Maya exhaled shakily. Her father wasn't just anyone. He was Police Commissioner Samuel Reynolds. And the officer who had just pepper-sprayed his daughter? He had no idea what was coming next. The silence that followed was deafening. The first officer, Officer Grayson, stiffened, his knuckles turning white around Maya's phone. The younger officer, still crouched by Maya's side, swallowed hard. This is Commissioner Reynolds, the voice repeated, sharper this time. Who is this? Grayson's jaw worked, his mouth suddenly dry. His gaze flickered down at Maya, who was still curled on the ground, her face streaked with tears and pepper spray. The weight of his mistake sank in, but it was too late to take it back. This is Officer Grayson with the Metro PD, he finally said, forcing his voice to sound steady. I have someone here. Someone. The commissioner's tone was ice. You have my daughter, don't you? Grayson flinched. The younger officer's eyes widened. Maya coughed, managing to turn her head slightly. Even through her blurred vision, she could see the panic setting in on Grayson's face. It gave her the slightest flicker of satisfaction, but it wasn't nearly enough to erase the pain still searing her skin. I wasn't aware she was your daughter, sir, Grayson stammered. Clearly, the commissioner's voice was controlled, but dangerously low. What happened? Grayson hesitated. He couldn't admit the truth. He couldn't say he had profiled her, assumed she was a threat, and used unnecessary force. There was a misunderstanding, he said instead. She fit a description of. I don't want excuses, Officer Grayson. I want to know what you did to my daughter. Grayson's grip on the phone tightened. She was uncooperative, and I had to subdue her. The silence on the other end stretched. Then the commissioner's voice came back, sharp as a blade. Did you use force? Grayson's throat bobbed. Sir, You used force on my daughter? Maya could hear the barely restrained fury in her father's voice. She. Grayson couldn't form a sentence. Where are you? The commissioner demanded. We're on 12th and Jackson near. I'll be there in 5 minutes, Commissioner Reynolds cut in. And Grayson swallowed. Sir, don't touch my daughter again. The call ended. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant hum of passing cars, the flickering of a street lamp overhead. Maya forced herself to sit up slightly, still coughing, her face wet with pain and frustration. The younger officer, who had stayed quiet through the exchange, finally spoke. Grayson, he murmured. You just screwed yourself. Grayson's face was rigid, but his eyes flickered with unease. Maya wiped at her burning face, glaring up at him. Even through the pain, she felt it, his fear, And for the first time tonight, she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The tension was suffocating. Officer Grayson stood rigid, gripping Maya's phone so tightly his fingers turned pale. The younger officer, his name tag reading Daniels, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Grayson and Maya. The street lamp above them buzzed softly, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Maya, still on the ground, wiped at her stinging eyes, the pain refusing to fade. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body still trembling. But beneath the pain, a fire burned. Her father was coming. She could see it now, the way Grayson's bravado had cracked the moment he heard her father's name. The way Daniel's face had paled when he realized just who they had arrested. A black teenager on the sidewalk at night? Suspicious. A police commissioner's daughter? Catastrophe. Grayson finally moved, tossing Maya's phone onto the hood of his cruiser like it had burned him. "Get her up," he muttered. Daniels hesitated. "Shouldn't we wait?" "Get her up." Daniels exhaled sharply, then crouched beside Maya, his voice softer. "Can you stand?" Maya didn't answer. Her skin still burned, and her legs felt weak, but she wasn't about to let Grayson manhandle her again. She nodded slowly. Daniels helped her up, keeping his touch light. She swayed slightly, but clenched her jaw, refusing to show weakness. The flashing lights of Grayson's cruiser cast long, ominous shadows across the pavement. Daniels glanced at his partner. "You should have just let her go home." Grayson shot him a glare. "You're not in charge here." Daniels muttered something under his breath but didn't argue. Then came the sound. Engines. Not one, not two, but several black SUVs rolling down the street in formation, their headlights slicing through the night. The hum of powerful engines sent a chill down Maya's spine. Grayson took a step back. The SUVs pulled up, tires screeching slightly as they halted. The doors flew open in unison, and from the lead vehicle, a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark brown skin. Commissioner Samuel Reynolds. Maya's father. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't need to be. The power in his stride, the sharpness in his gaze. It was enough to make both officers tense. His eyes locked onto Maya, and for a split second, his face softened with something unreadable. Relief, concern, anger. Then his gaze snapped to Grayson. "What the hell did you do to my daughter?" His voice was low, controlled, but it carried the weight of a thunderstorm ready to break. Grayson straightened his shoulders. "Sir, I don't want excuses." Reynolds took another step forward. The other officers from the SUVs stayed back, watching, waiting. Daniels looked away, his jaw clenched. He already knew how this was going to end. Grayson swallowed hard. She matched a description. She refused to comply. Maya's father's expression didn't change. "So you pepper-sprayed her?" Silence. Grayson opened his mouth, closed it. Reynolds exhaled sharply, turning to his daughter. His voice softened. "Maya, are you okay?" Maya's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, wanted to be strong, but the pain, the humiliation, the fear, it all crashed down at once. Her lips trembled. He grabbed me. I tried to explain. He wouldn't listen." Reynolds' entire body went rigid. His hands clenched at his sides. Daniels took a small step back, putting just a little more distance between himself and Grayson. Then Reynolds spoke. "Officer Grayson, you're suspended effective immediately." Grayson's eyes widened. "Sir, you don't speak." The authority in Reynolds' voice was enough to make Grayson snap his mouth shut. One of the men from the SUVs stepped forward, dressed in plain clothes, but Maya knew who he was, Internal Affairs. "Escort Officer Grayson to headquarters," Reynolds said, his eyes never leaving the man who had attacked his daughter. Grayson went pale. "Sir, please, turn in your badge and weapon." Grayson looked around, as if expecting someone to save him, but no one moved. Daniels was silent. The IA officer was already reaching for him. And Commissioner Reynolds? He was looking at Grayson like he was nothing. Maya watched as Grayson finally realized the gravity of what he had done. He had seen her as just another black teenager on the street, just another suspicious person. But now he saw her as something else entirely. The daughter of the one man who could end him. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. The street, once filled with Grayson's unchecked authority, was now drowned in the overwhelming presence of the commissioner and his team. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off Maya's tear-streaked face as she stood, shoulders still trembling, watching the man who had assaulted her finally face the consequences. The internal affairs officer took a firm step toward Grayson, his expression unreadable. "Officer Grayson, hand over your badge and weapon." Grayson stood frozen. His eyes darted toward Daniels, but there was no lifeline there. The younger officer kept his gaze down, jaw clenched, as if he wanted no part in what was happening. Reynolds took a slow step forward, his voice measured but seething with restrained fury. "Do you need me to repeat myself?" Grayson hesitated for just a second too long. The IA officer stepped in without hesitation. With practiced efficiency, he unlatched Grayson's duty belt, removed his service weapon, and unpinned his badge. The metallic clink of the badge hitting the pavement sent a chill down Maya's spine. Grayson's hands twitched at his sides, his breath uneven. "Sir, please. I didn't know who she was." That was the wrong thing to say. Reynolds' eyes darkened, his entire frame stiffening with something dangerous. "So if she were someone else, just any other black teenager walking home, you would have treated her the same way? That's what you're telling me?" Grayson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Maya felt a fresh surge of emotion rise in her chest. Anger, frustration, exhaustion. This was the problem. He hadn't seen her as a person. He had seen her as a threat, a suspect, and now, standing there with his career slipping through his fingers, he still didn't understand what he had done wrong. The IA officer motioned toward the SUV. "Let's go." Grayson looked like he wanted to fight it, wanted to argue, but he knew better. He gave one last glance at Commissioner Reynolds before finally, reluctantly, stepping toward the vehicle. The door shut behind him with a solid thunk. For the first time that night, Maya let out a slow breath. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was something. Reynolds turned to Daniels. "Officer Daniels." Daniels immediately straightened. "Sir, you were here the whole time?" Daniels hesitated but nodded. "Yes, sir." "Did you stop him?" The younger officer swallowed hard. I didn't know what was happening at first. By the time I got here, he had already—" His voice faltered, eyes flickering toward Maya. "I should have done more." Reynolds studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You should have." He exhaled, the fury in his shoulders slowly easing. "Go back to your unit. Expect a full inquiry." "Yes, sir." Daniels gave Maya one last look, this one filled with something like regret, before he turned and headed toward his squad car. Finally, it was just Maya and her father. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened still loomed over them, heavy and suffocating. Then Reynolds stepped closer. His voice, no longer the sharp blade of a commanding officer, softened. "Maya." That single word, her name, broke something inside her. A sob ripped from her throat, and before she knew it, she was in his arms. His strong, steady hands cradled the back of her head as she buried her face against his chest, her body shaking from everything she had held in. The pain, the fear, the anger, it all spilled out at once. "I was so scared," she whispered. Reynolds' grip tightened. "I know." His voice was thick with something she wasn't used to hearing from him. Guilt. "I should have been here sooner." Maya pulled back slightly, her eyes still wet. "He didn't even see me. He just saw some girl who didn't belong." Reynolds' face hardened again. But this time, it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper. Determination. "That's going to change." Maya sniffed. "How?" He placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with an unshakable promise. "Because I'm going to make damn sure it does." And for the first time that night, Maya believed him. The ride home was silent. Maya sat in the passenger seat of her father's black SUV, Her hands curled into fists in her lap. The sting of the pepper spray still clung to her skin, a harsh reminder of everything that had happened. Her father, usually a man of unwavering composure, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The streetlights flashed past in streaks of yellow and orange, but neither of them spoke. What was there to say? Maya's mind raced with everything that had just unfolded. The way Grayson had grabbed her. The way Daniels had hesitated. The way her father had commanded the moment he arrived, shifting the entire balance of power. And the way Grayson's expression had changed when he realized who she was. She let out a shaky breath, staring out the window. "If I weren't your daughter," she said softly, breaking the silence, "nothing would have happened to him, would it?" Reynolds inhaled sharply but didn't answer right away. Maya turned her head, watching his jaw tighten. His silence said more than words ever could. "That's what I thought." Her voice was bitter. Reynolds finally spoke, his tone measured. "You shouldn't have been in that situation to begin with." Maya clenched her jaw. "But I was." He exhaled through his nose. "And I made sure there were consequences." She laughed, but it was humorless. For him. But what about the next girl? The next person who isn't lucky enough to have a father who can make one phone call and end a man's career? The question hung heavy between them. Her father stopped at a red light, staring straight ahead, his face unreadable. "I can't fix everything in one night, Maya." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "But you can do something, right?" Reynolds turned to look at her, his gaze softer now. "I will." The light turned green, and they continued the drive home, the tension between them shifting but still present. Maya wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, but deep down, she knew that one fired officer didn't change the bigger problem. She had spent years hearing about injustices. She had watched the news, seen the protests, read the names of people who never got the justice she had received in one night. What about them? By the time they pulled into their driveway, Maya felt exhausted. The night had drained everything from her. Her energy, her emotions, her belief that she could simply exist without being questioned. Reynolds put the car in park and turned to her. "I want you to rest." Maya scoffed. "Like that's gonna happen." He sighed, running a hand over his face. For the first time he looked truly tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a long day, but the exhaustion of a man who had spent years fighting a system he was still a part of. "I'll handle this," he said. "You don't have to carry it alone." Maya looked at him, her eyes burning. Not from the pepper spray, but from the weight of it all. "I don't want you to just handle it, Dad. I want things to actually change." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Then we make them change." Maya held his gaze. "How?" He didn't answer right away. But when he did, his voice was steady. "Certain. We start with the truth." She didn't know what that meant yet. Didn't know what her father was planning. But for the first time that night, she felt something she hadn't expected to. Hope. The next morning, Maya woke up with a lingering heaviness in her chest. The events of the night before replayed in her mind like a bad dream, except it wasn't a dream. It was real. The fear, the humiliation, the way Officer Grayson had looked at her like she didn't belong. She sat up in bed, rubbing her face, feeling the dried remnants of the tears she had cried into her pillow after finally being alone. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A flood of notifications, missed calls, texts, social media alerts. The world was already moving, reacting, spreading what had happened. Maya hesitated before clicking on one of the messages from her best friend. "Tasha. Girl, your name is everywhere. Call me ASAP." Her stomach clenched. Everywhere? She scrolled through her social media feed, and her heart pounded as she saw the video circulating. The one she hadn't even known someone had recorded. It was shaky, probably taken from across the street, but clear enough. Officer Grayson grabbing her, his hand shoving her backward. The moment he pulled out the pepper spray. The way she had screamed. The way her father had arrived and shut everything down in an instant. Thousands of comments. Some outraged. Some supportive. Some doubting her. "We don't know what she was doing before this started." People need to stop playing the victim. Of course she got special treatment. She's the commissioner's daughter. Imagine if she was just another random kid. Wouldn't even be news. Maya's breath hitched. This was what she had feared the most. Even with the truth laid out for the world to see, there were still people who would twist it, deny it, justify it. And the worst part? They weren't wrong about one thing. If she weren't Reynolds' daughter, Grayson would still be on duty today. A knock at her door pulled her out of her thoughts. Maya! Her father's voice. She hesitated before answering. Yeah. The door opened, and Commissioner Reynolds stepped inside. He was still in his uniform, looking as sharp as ever, but there was an undeniable exhaustion in his eyes. He had barely slept, she could tell. I need you to come with me, he said. Maya frowned. Where? To the precinct. Her stomach dropped. Why? Because this isn't over, Reynolds said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. I want you to see what happens next. The police station felt different than usual. Maya had been here before, back when she was younger, visiting her father at work. Back when she still saw this place as a pillar of justice. Now it felt like walking into enemy territory. The moment she stepped through the doors, every officer in the room turned to look at her. Some expressions were unreadable. Others were downright hostile. And then there were the ones filled with something that almost looked like shame. Her father walked beside her, his presence commanding, but Maya still felt the weight of their stares. At the front desk, a younger officer looked up, visibly nervous. Sir. Reynolds didn't stop walking. Where's the chief? In the conference room. They're waiting. Maya swallowed hard. Waiting for what? Her father led her down a hallway, past rows of desks where officers whispered among themselves. She caught bits and pieces of their conversations. They really brought her here? This is a PR nightmare. Grayson screwed up, but still. The conference room door stood open, and inside sat several high-ranking officers, including the police chief and a representative from Internal Affairs. Maya recognized some of them from events she had been forced to attend with her father over the years. The chief, an older white man with silver hair, looked at her father first. Commissioner Reynolds. Then his gaze flicked to her. Miss Reynolds. Maya's hands curled into fists at the polite address. Like he hadn't seen the video. Her father didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, looking every single person in the room in the eye. We're not sweeping this under the rug, he said. The room was silent. Finally, the chief sighed. No one is suggesting we do. Grayson has been relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Maya scoffed. He should have been arrested. A few officers stiffened at her words. One, a woman with short blonde hair, spoke up. Miss Reynolds, I understand your anger, but no. Maya interrupted, her voice sharp. You don't. She took a step forward, heart pounding. You don't understand what it's like to be seen as a threat just for existing. You don't understand what it's like to have someone look at you and decide, right then and there, that you must be up to something, that you must be guilty. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Grayson didn't see me as a girl walking home. He saw me as a suspect. And if that's how your officers are trained to think, then the problem isn't just him. The chief's expression tightened. We take these matters very seriously. Maya laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you? Reynolds placed a firm hand on her shoulder, not to silence her, but to steady her. Then he turned back to the room. We're conducting a full internal review, not just of Grayson's actions, but of the culture that allowed it to happen. The room tensed. Sir, one officer spoke. With all due respect, we can't punish every officer for one man's mistake. Reynolds' jaw tightened. No, but we can make damn sure it doesn't happen again. Silence. The chief finally exhaled, nodding. We'll move forward with the investigation, and the community will expect transparency. Reynolds nodded once. Good. Maya stood there, heart still racing, as the meeting moved into formalities. But she barely heard the words, because for the first time since last night, She didn't feel helpless. She had spoken. They had listened. And now things were going to change. Maya walked out of the precinct feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. The confrontation in the conference room had felt like a battle. A battle she hadn't been fully prepared for but had fought anyway. And yet, despite everything that had been said, despite her father's promise to push for change, a gnawing feeling in her gut told her it wasn't enough. A man had attacked her under the guise of the law. And if it hadn't been for her father's power, if it hadn't been for the video spreading online, would any of this even be happening? Her father walked beside her, silent but thoughtful. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit her skin, grounding her in reality. Across the street, she noticed reporters gathering, cameras flashing, microphones being raised in anticipation. The story had already grown beyond them. She turned to her father. "What happens now?" He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Now we make sure people don't forget." Maya's phone buzzed again. More notifications. More voices flooding her feed. But this time, something else caught her attention. A new trending hashtag. Hashtag justice for Maya. She blinked, stunned. It wasn't something she had started. But someone, maybe one of the people who had seen the video, had. And now it was spreading like wildfire. Before she could process it, a voice called out from the crowd of reporters. "Commissioner Reynolds. Maya, can you comment on what's happening?" Maya looked at her father. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Let's do this." They walked toward the cameras, and before the reporters could bombard them with questions, Reynolds spoke first. "My daughter was assaulted by a police officer," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "An officer who swore an oath to protect and serve, but instead saw her as a threat." The crowd hushed. He continued, "We have taken immediate action against the officer in question. But this isn't just about one man's actions. This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to continue unchecked." Maya swallowed hard as every eye turned toward her. She hadn't planned on speaking, but she knew she had to. She needed to. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Last night, I was walking home. That's it. I wasn't committing a crime. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But that officer looked at me and assumed I didn't belong. That I was suspicious. That I was guilty." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "But what scares me the most," she said, her voice raw, "is knowing that if my father weren't who he is, I'd still be sitting in a cell right now. Or worse." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maya took a breath. "I know people are talking about this because of my last name, because I was lucky enough to have power on my side. But what about all the other black kids this happens to who don't have that? Who never get justice? Who never even get believed?" She met the eyes of the reporters, of the people watching from the sidewalk. "This isn't just about me. This is about them." The cameras flashed. The murmurs grew louder. And in that moment, Maya realized something. She had a voice, and she was going to use it. Reynolds placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent show of support. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "But it starts somewhere." Maya nodded. "And it starts now." The press conference ended, but the fire inside her had only just begun. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. And this fight wasn't over yet. Maya sat in the back seat of her father's car as they drove away from the press conference, her mind racing. The adrenaline from speaking in front of the cameras was still coursing through her veins, but underneath it all, there was something else, something heavier. She had spoken her truth. She had put it out into the world, raw and unfiltered. But now the world was reacting. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She glanced down at the notifications flooding her screen. "Stay strong, Maya. We got your back. This is exactly why we say Black Lives Matter." Finally, someone with power speaking up. "We need this. She's just playing the victim. Typical. She got assaulted? Please, try being a cop for one day." Her stomach twisted at the last few comments. She knew not everyone would be on her side, but seeing the hate mixed in with the support made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. Her father must have noticed her silence because he spoke without taking his eyes off the road. "You did the right thing back there," Maya exhaled. "Did I?" "Yes." His voice was firm, unwavering. "You stood up not just for yourself, but for every kid who's been through what you have. And now people are listening." Maya bit her lip. "Yeah, but some of them are just listening to tear me down." Reynolds let out a slow breath. "They always will. People don't like to confront ugly truths. It makes them uncomfortable. But change doesn't come from making people comfortable, Maya." She knew he was right, but knowing it didn't make the weight on her chest any lighter. The car slowed as they pulled into their driveway. Maya hesitated before stepping out, suddenly feeling exposed. The world outside didn't feel the same anymore. She had walked home just last night, thinking she was safe. Now, she wasn't sure if she'd ever feel safe again. Inside the house, her mother was waiting. The moment Maya stepped in, she was wrapped in a tight hug. "Oh, baby," her mother murmured, stroking her hair. "I saw you on the news. You were so strong." Maya closed her eyes, letting herself be held for just a moment before pulling away. "I don't feel strong." Her mother cupped her face. "Strength isn't about what you feel, sweetheart. It's about what you do. And you're doing something." Maya swallowed hard, nodding. Then her father's phone rang. Reynolds glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. He stepped away to answer. "Yes." Maya and her mother exchanged a glance. His voice remained calm, but Maya could tell something was wrong. "Understood. I'll be there soon." He hung up and turned to them. "That was internal affairs." His voice was tight. "Grayson wants to talk." Maya's heart skipped a beat. "What?" she whispered. Reynolds exhaled. "He's requesting a meeting. With you." Her mother's brows furrowed. "Absolutely not. She doesn't need to see that man again." Maya felt her pulse quicken. "Why would he want to talk to me?" Reynolds' jaw clenched. "That's what I intend to find out." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Maya took a deep breath. "I want to go." Her mother's eyes widened. "Maya, I have to," she insisted. "I need to look him in the eye and hear what he has to say. If I'm going to fight for change, I can't be afraid to face the people who tried to silence me." Her father studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right." Maya steeled herself, her hands trembling slightly as she clenched them into fists. She had come this far. She wasn't backing down now. Maya sat in the car, staring out the window as the city blurred past. The weight of what was coming pressed down on her chest, but she refused to let it break her. She had stood in front of the cameras and told the truth. Now, she was about to come face to face with the man who had tried to take that truth away from her. Detective Grayson. Her father sat beside her, silent but watchful. He hadn't been thrilled about her coming, but he had respected her decision. And now, as they pulled up to the precinct, Maya felt a rush of cold determination settle over her. This wasn't about fear. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers watched as she walked in, their eyes flickering with unreadable expressions. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked resentful. A few avoided her gaze altogether. Maya didn't care. She followed her father down the hallway, past the same holding cells she could have been locked in had things gone differently. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she kept moving forward. Finally, they reached the interview room. Her father pushed the door open, and there he was. Grayson, the man who had pepper-sprayed her, who had thrown her to the ground and called her suspicious. Now he sat at the metal table, hands folded, looking far less sure of himself than the last time they had met. His uniform was gone, replaced with a standard precinct-issued gray shirt. His badge? Nowhere in sight. For the first time, Maya saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. She stepped inside, her pulse steady, and sat across from him. Her father remained standing, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. Grayson exhaled. "I appreciate you coming." Maya narrowed her eyes. Did I have a choice? His jaw tightened. No. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, finally, Grayson leaned forward. I wanted to say I was wrong. Maya didn't blink. You were more than wrong. He flinched slightly but nodded. Yeah, I was. He hesitated before continuing. Look, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve to be sitting here talking to you. But I needed to say it. Maya studied him carefully. The tough, confident officer she had seen before was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had been forced to confront something ugly in himself. But did that mean he had changed? She leaned forward. You looked at me and didn't see a person. You saw a problem. Her voice was steady, cold. You didn't ask questions. You didn't hesitate. You just acted like you had the right to hurt me. Grayson swallowed hard. I know. No, you don't, she snapped. Because if my father wasn't who he is, you wouldn't be sitting here apologizing. You'd still be out there doing the same thing to someone else. Grayson's face paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Maya exhaled, trying to calm the fire inside her. Why did you ask to see me? He hesitated, then finally spoke. Because I need you to know, I didn't target you because I knew who you were. I targeted you because I didn't. Maya frowned. I've done this job a long time, he continued, voice low. And I was trained to see certain people as threats before they even do anything. That's how the system works. And he sighed, running a hand down his face. I never questioned it. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. He met her eyes. Until now, she wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent so much time feeling rage, feeling pain, that she had never considered this moment. What it would mean to hear the man who had hurt her admit that he was the problem. Not just him. The whole system. She took a deep breath. So what now? Grayson looked down. I don't know. I lost my badge. I'm under investigation. My career is over. He exhaled. And maybe that's what I deserve. Maya studied him. Then slowly, she stood up. You don't get points for realizing the truth after you've already done the damage, she said. But if you really mean what you're saying, then don't just let your career end. Do something. Speak out. Admit what you've done. Not just to me, but to everyone. Grayson looked up at her, surprised. You think anyone would listen to me? Maya shrugged. That's not my problem. She stepped toward the door. But I know one thing. You don't get to just walk away from this. Grayson nodded slowly, as if letting her words settle into his bones. Maya turned to her father. I'm done here. Reynolds nodded, opening the door for her. As she stepped out of the room, she felt something shift inside her. This fight wasn't over. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready.